Hello, my name is Mary Jane McCallum, and I'm here to introduce the third in a lecture series on Indigenous histories of in education. So the series is sponsored by the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous People, History and Archives, and is hosted by the Winter 2025 class of the University of Winnipeg's students in History 2616, History of Indigenous Education, Residential Schools and Beyond. It's facilitated by Studio 1L10 and the great staff here at the University of Winnipeg and by Catherine Boschman. In this series, invited guests do a formal lecture for between 20 and 45 minutes. And at that point, we excuse those who are guests on Zoom, and then we turn to a class discussion between the students and the lecturer. So our invited speaker today is Gail Fraser, who's coming to us in our classroom over Zoom. So Gail Fraser is Gwichyà Gwich'in, and originally from Inuvik and Dachan, Choo, hnjik, in the Northwest Territories. She's an associate professor in the Department of History, Classics and Religion, and in the Faculty of Native Studies. Dr. Fraser's major works are on histories of student experiences in Indian residential schools in the Inuvik Region from about the late 1950s to the 1990s. The title of her talk comes from her recently published book, By Strength, We Are Still Here. And the focus today is on Indigenous children's culture at Inuvik's residential schools. So I'll turn it over to you now, Gail.
Well, Dringwinzi Shilikat, it is great to be here with you. Shori Gail Fraser, Vilji, Inuvik at Dachan, Choo, hnjik, Gwichyà Gwich'in, Italy. That is my way of introducing myself and sharing that I'm originally from Inuvik and my fish camp in Dachan, Choo, hnjik in the Northwest Territories. It's really great to be here. So lovely to see so many folks in person and on Zoom. Thank you, Dr. McCallum, for the invitation and for all of the organizers here in order to make this happen. So I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here. Let's see here. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about my new book, By Strength, We Are Still Here, and a little bit about children's culture at Inuvik's Indian residential schools. Of course, this is hard content. We're going to be talking about institutionalization, child removal policies, child death and colonialism expressed through Indian residential schools. So I have some resources here. Feel free to take a screenshot of this or a picture, or please reach out to myself, your instructor, or any of the organizers here afterwards if you need further support. So introductions is a pretty important part of this work, I feel, and I always ground myself in where I come from, who I'm related to, and who really inspired this work, who are my mentors and my leaders. So the first would be my great-grandmother, Julian Dept. The Dachan means the one who carries a feather. This is her smoking a pipe, an artistic image of my great-grandmother. She was born in 1889 and she died in 1983. And she was a matriarch, fur trader, a trapper, a linguist. She spoke many languages, not English. She also had over a dozen children, some of whom were institutionalized at Indian residential schools. One of those children were her daughter, Marka Bullock, on the far right. This is my grandmother at our fish camp. And my grandmother was really foundational in my life, as she was the one who taught me how to cut fish and our relationship with waterways and fish and the land. You can see me in the image right next to her hanging fish strips. I was the first of about 40 grandchildren, so I had a handful of years or so alone with Marka at our fish camp before other children started arriving. And then, of course, on the far left here, and this photo is now a little bit dated, but you can see me and my mother Juliet, and my sister Wineo, and my daughter Quinn, and this is to reaffirm that we have an ongoing matriarchal culture that we work within, and so many of those who have led me and inspired me, and from whom I gain strength, are women. My grandmother Marka on the right, she was institutionalized at Immaculate Conception Indian Residential School in Aklavik, Northwest Territories. And then my mother on the far left, at Grolier Hall in Inuvik, Northwest Territories. And some people are unfamiliar with the Arctic. And so I always show this kind of map, which kind of situates my homelands within the broader context of the colonial Canadian borders. So you'll see, you can probably find yourselves in Winnipeg, and then you look pretty far northwest. Top red shaded area is the Inuvialuit settlement region. The Inuvialuit are our neighbors, and we share the communities of Aklavik and Inuvik with them. Then below is the land that we negotiated in our modern treaty in the early 1990s, which is now called the Gwich'in settlement area. And then to the south is the Sahtu settlement area. And a part of what you're looking at is also covered by Treaty 11, and it's also covered by other modern treaty agreements. But really, my nation, we call ourselves hnjik, but of course you can be more specific to community and region, and that's why I am Gwichyà Gwich'in. Our nation historically spanned northern Alaska, northern Yukon, and the northwestern part of the Northwest Territories, and so the parcel of land that we agreed to in the modern treaty is really a fraction of Gwich'in homelands. But this is where I'm from. I'm coming to you today, though, from Treaty 6, homeland of the Métis Nation. I've lived here for about 20 years. You know, I am in history and Native studies at the University of Alberta, but I am in regular touch with my home community, and really I view the North as still my home. So I think that these conversations about residential schools need to be grounded in current conversations about child death and unmarked graves. I'm sure some of your previous speakers have also touched on this, and this conversation, you know, unfolded in an international way in May of 2021. Many of us will remember this like yesterday. It really opened up a lot of pain and trauma for survivors and for communities. Of course, Indigenous communities had always known about their ancestors and relatives and friends who had gone missing or died while institutionalized. But really, the last 4 years has shown, a remarkable increase in residential schooling research for a number of reasons, and so these conversations are ongoing, and we've learned collectively as a country that Indigenous children in the thousands did die while at residential schools, and they really passed away through a number of methods and for different reasons. So food and nutrition, in 2013, Ian Mosby wrote an article called Administering Colonial Science, which really exposed these nutrition experiments at residential schools for the first time. We also know about school conditions, overcrowding, poor sanitation, conditions meaning that school infrastructure was unstable and old. That could lead to fires and conditions of mold, etc. We also know that quarters were cramped, overcrowding, which led to an increase of disease such as tuberculosis, measles, mumps, influenza. And we also know that proper healthcare services were often not available to residential school children. And this is especially true in the Arctic. We also know that policy was not followed, that these residential schools often had very little oversight, again, especially in the Arctic when you are so far away from Ottawa, and there was a hard time filling jobs for Indian agents, for example. So very few people to oversee the actual system and any sorts of rules that were in place. We also know that children died through violent crimes and through suicide as well. We also know that children disappeared while they were institutionalized, and those stories are sometimes still a mystery to people. And so if anybody wants to read more specifically about how children disappeared, I would recommend you to the final report of the Office of the Special Interlocutor. We also know that this is the 10-year anniversary of the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Again, Ian Mosby and his colleague Eva Jewell had been keeping track of the 94 calls to action and which calls were implemented. And there were specific calls prior to the conversation around unmarked graves in 2021 that specifically outlined work that needed to be done regarding missing children and unmarked graves. And those are calls to action 71 through 76. We also know that the TRC final report had a whole volume on unmarked graves. So again, this research has been underway for a while, but it's only been over the last few years that really this has come to national attention. We also know that there's been a lot of work that has been done. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is a great champion of these histories. Their work is ongoing. Again, the Office of the of the independent special interlocutor. I would encourage everyone to engage with their materials. And then also the National Advisory Committee on Residential Schools, Missing Children, and Unmarked Burials. I'm a founding member of that committee, and our work is ongoing as well. We're having a community event actually in Whitehorse next week to talk about that work, as well as an event in Calgary at the end of March. We also know that as this research and work is on the rise, and as we're learning and uncovering more truths about residential school histories, that we're seeing an increase in denialism and untruths. I've given talks on this before, but it does seem to be a continuing and persisting problem. And so as we go through these histories together, I just offer some ideas about how to counter misinformation or untruths or harm that may be inflicted on you or your communities. So stay grounded in who you are and where you come from. Stay in touch with community. Know your facts. I have found this really important because mistruths or untruths are not rooted in fact. So the ability to reference people, places, and years. And so I have worked with many survivors over the years, and it's not my place to tell their story, but I have memorized their stories, and that way I can share appropriate parts of their stories with folks who are open-minded. If you're a settler, actively embrace reconciliation, engage in archival research, but think critically about it. Know the nuances between ignorance and more harmful aspects like white supremacy, and thinking about the bigger picture. So these are just some points that have helped me along the way that I thought I would share with you today. So my book, By Strength, We Are Still Here, Indigenous Peoples and Indian Residential Schooling in Inuvik, Northwest Territories, came out about 2 months ago. And this was really the result of about 15 years of research. This was my PhD thesis, which I defended in 2019. And then I spent the next few years doing additional research, engaging in more interviews, and rewriting my thesis for a book format. And that was really a project of community engaged research. And so it was not community-based research because I no longer live in Inuvik, but I regularly travel there. I am in close touch with elders and historians and survivors. And what I learned is that community is very eager to be involved in all aspects of the project, and that would include right from conceptualizing the initial ideas to applying for funding, to engaging in the interview process and research process itself, and offering feedback and encouragement at every step of the way. But of course, even if we engage with our own community, even if we're from there and we're working with family and relatives and friends and mentors, we also have to be aware that these communities, especially in the North, have been engaged in harmful relationships with academia and with academics who have used Indigenous communities as a way to profit, as a way to build their careers, and it has not been a relationship of reciprocity. So keeping that in mind, and even though you may belong to that community, you still have a responsibility to try and undo that damage. So the book really engaged in two different processes. I always prioritized oral histories and community engagement, and then used archives as a way to find answers that were not in the interviews, or to supplement. And in my experience, many Canadian historians have done the reverse, starting at the archive in order to inform their research questions, and then going to people in order to fill in blanks. And because this was community engaged, I did the very opposite. So I took a little bit of a different approach. And if I were to do things differently now, I think I would have even placed less of a priority on the archives. I think the discipline of history is slowly changing, but even 10 or 15 years ago, archival experience and research was still really fundamental to a PhD in Canadian history. So going forward, what I enjoy is engaging with community, undertaking research that will actually be helpful, and I don't necessarily find that at the archive. Always acknowledging where we come from at every step of the way is important to me. Knowing that there have been trailblazers who came before me. Again, on the left here is a photo of my great-grandmother, Julian the Dachan, and my cousin, Alistine Andre, who is also an anthropologist, and they are actually giving public testimony at the Berger inquiry in 1976 in Sigachik. And so knowing that we come from storytelling people, we have oral histories, this is a practice that we have engaged in since time immemorial. And also acknowledging the published oral histories that have come before me as well, out of the Gwich'in Nation in the north. So a couple examples of that on your screen. Here's a great photo of myself with Elder Agnes Mitchell. This is at our fish camp. And again, like engaging in this kind of work really just benefits everyone. There are various levels of self-care involved. But in this case, we can all apply for funding as academics. We were able to hire local people to help with the interviews. Agnes's grandson, Dallas, is on the right. He was able to engage in an internship in this process as a Gwich'in youth and get some experience. I was able to pay Agnes like a really nice honorarium. And so this work can actually make a difference in people's immediate lives, obviously making a contribution to a bigger project, but carrying on our traditions of storytelling and engaging in community, while acknowledging that these are very hard histories and that self-care really does need to be involved for everyone along the way. I also came to learn that elders and knowledge keepers really have, theorized many of these ideas for many decades. And so this is an example from Tetlek Gwich'in Elder Mary Effie Snowshoe, and this is how she has theorized colonization. And this image did not actually come from an interview that we did. It was at a language workshop in Fort McPherson. And I have never seen colonization in the North laid out this way by any sort of academic. And the way that Mary Effie was able to break it down and explain it really adds a lot of nuance and understanding and structure. And so knowing that we can turn to our own people, many of whom do not have, quote unquote, official PhDs or graduate level education, but are highly theoretical and can offer insights that no one else can. So this work also really allowed me to engage with Indigenous forms of strength. That's one question that I really grappled with at every turn of my interviews, was how is it that this is a system of genocide, that residential schools were carceral, violent, and oppressive places, yet many survivors who I talked to shared stories about strength. They talked about how they persisted. They talked about how they pushed back against the system. I didn't understand how these two things could be true at the same time until I looked to Gwich'in forms of strength. And Agnes Mitchell and I, we theorized three different forms by turning to language. And so we have ancestral strength, we have personal strength, and also collective and community strength. And as I was learning about these Gwich'in concepts, I was also reading outside the discipline of history. I was reading in Indigenous studies. I looked to Indigenous education scholar Eve Tuck's work. Eve Tuck called for a moratorium on damage-centered research. She said that, in my interpretation, what she said was, if you are Indigenous and you are working alongside Indigenous community, that we can no longer think of ourselves as broken. And so I took up that call, but also very important to acknowledge that if you are a settler scholar or if you are non-Indigenous, we still need answers about truth and reconciliation. We still need to know about genocide. We still need somebody in the archives understanding the history of Indian affairs and statistics and accounting and residential schools. And so I look at this moratorium on damage-centered research as a call specifically for Indigenous scholars who want to work with community. So where did I begin? Really, it was in Inuklavik. My grandmother, as I mentioned, was institutionalized at the Immaculate Conception Indian Residential School in Inuklavik that was run by the Oblates. And here I do have a few photos from the archive. This is how archives can really be so helpful. It's hard to find Indigenous voices in the archive, but photos are just this brilliant way where we can connect with our ancestors and our loved ones. We can see a visual representation of them, of what they may have experienced. We can imagine what they may have been thinking, but we can also use photographs in a way to think critically about them and to gain insights of how residential schools operated. And so, like the two photos on each side, on the left and the right, we can connect with these children, but we can also see that they were engaged in labor, that these residential schools could not operate without the labor of children. In the black and white image, we have a student who is baking like dozens of loaves of bread. On the right, we have a number of children who are unloading wood from a barge, and that was going to be their fuel through the winter in order to keep the residential school warm. In the middle, we see children who are wearing what we call parkies. So they were allowed to wear traditional Inuvik and Gwich'in clothing in the Arctic because missionary clothing does not cut it at -50 or -60. But they are holding flags that reflect Great Britain. There is a gray nun right there standing over them. And so we can see various ways in which they were brainwashed is what survivor Sarah Jerome called her stay at the residential schools in Aklavik, Inuvik, and Yellowknife. And this is the other interesting thing about the North is the way the Northern system was built and implemented in the North actually meant that many children are survivors of multi residential schools. So, for example, Sarah Jerome, who I mentioned, you can watch her talk on YouTube, but she was institutionalized at 3 different residential schools in the North over her life. Now, when Inuvik was built in the late 1950s, this is my home community, Inuvik was built to replace Aklavik. That is kind of a different story, but the residential schools in Aklavik closed and the ones in Inuvik replaced them. And so I have a couple of images here on the right in the very middle. That is Sir Alexander Mackenzie's school. And then in the background, we have the residential schools, Gwichyà Hall and Stringer Hall. You can see sort of that same image, but from a different angle, the photo in the left. And there is also the Igloo Church, an icon of Inuvik, which still stands today. And in the middle, I have a photo of these utilidors that run between the buildings. And you can read a little bit more about them in the book. They really acted as a geographical boundary and a liminal space that was sometimes quite dangerous for kids. So this is all to say that the system in Inuvik was different than it was down south. And so in the middle here, I mentioned Sir Alexander Mackenzie School. I went to that school as a child. But this was the Indian Day School. And this was the school for all children in Inuvik, settler kids, Indigenous kids, but also residential school kids. Gwichyà Hall, which is the purple building here, that was the Roman Catholic institution run by the Oblates. And then on the right, the kind of tan colored one was Stringer Hall, run by the Anglican Church. And how it worked is that these children were taken from their families and placed at Gwichyà Hall or Stringer Hall, and then they would leave every day and go to Sir Alexander Mackenzie's school with all of the other children in the town. And so it was a little bit of a different setup in Inuvik. And we also know that Inuvik really reached every single corner of Canada, that it was a beacon for the progress of the Canadian nation state. If you look at any newspaper in the late 1950s, 1960s, Inuvik was in the spotlight, and it was really celebrated as this place of Canadian progress and modernity. There was a military base there, a fancy new research lab, airport. There was new resource development, a lot going on. But For part of that reason, thousands of Indigenous children were relocated to Inuvik. And so as far north as Grise Fjord, as far east as Happy Valley Goose Bay, as far south as Fort McMurray, Alberta, and then as far west to one of our Gwich'in communities, Old Crow in Yukon. And so really the complexity of Inuvik, you can see over the vast geography and the various connections that can be made. And, I have found that there were children from over 40 different communities who were institutionalized at Inuvik. So it becomes this complicated story that involves many Indigenous nations and communities. We also know that, like other residential schools, this is a common narrative across the board. Doesn't matter what year, what administrator, what religion, what location, what administrative district. We know across the board that residential schools were carceral and violent spaces. And this was the same in Inuvik. Gwichyà Hall has become known for really one of the most notorious institutions. The TRC final report had said that over the course of Gwichyà Hall, so from 1959 to 1996, there was never a year in which a predator was not on staff. So we have multiple generations of Indigenous children who were sexually or physically assaulted. And so I have this image in the book as well. This actually comes from a government newsletter for teachers from the Department of Education in the late 1970s. You can see here what looks like a non-Indigenous teacher, I would assume, and a student who is cowered over trying to protect their head. You wouldn't know it from this photo, but looking at other archival photos and yearbooks, this is the Gwichyà Hall residential school uniform. And so they are wearing the checkered shirt, and they're actually wearing their mukleks here because they were allowed to, but this is called government or state sanctioned violence against Indigenous kids. And so this was something that was very much allowed and a part of the schooling culture. But as in the title of my talk, there were other forms of children's culture. And so, I mean, if we just go back for a second, like a culture of violence, that is a part of children's culture at residential schools. It is like the sad part and the part that never should have happened. And as I talk about in the book and the readings that were assigned for the week, there were various ways in which children fought back against the violence, and that included running away. It included breaking the rules. But heading to this other slide now, it also included ways of building community and ways of trying to survive. And so a part of my work with stories and survivors shows that kids sometimes double down on the good things that were available to them at residential school in order to better grapple with the violent experiences. And so, of course, these kinds of histories we need to approach with a very delicate balance. We need to acknowledge, and I speak about this a little bit later, but these two things can be true at the same time. You can have violence and carceral spaces that are like prisons. You can have sexual and physical assault. You can have genocide. but alongside that can also exist Indigenous forms of strength. And here we see how some children at Grolier and Stringer Hall embodied Indigenous forms of strength in order to try to make a life for themselves while at residential school. One example is the Territorial Experimental Ski Program, also known as TEST. So this was implemented in 1967, which trained kids in cross-country skiing. There was very obvious racial undertones to that program. The whole point was to make them into nice white Canadians who could succeed and no longer be Indigenous. But students actually used on-the-land sports as a way to further reconnect with their identity and as a way to excel. And so, for example, on the left is a photo of Shirley and Sharon Firth, who became four-time Olympians with cross-country skiing. Sharon Firth is still alive, and she lives in Canmore, and has openly shared her story about residential school and skiing. And so skiing was a way to physically be on the land. You had to leave the residential school in order to ski. So children were removing themselves from that environment and able to be on the land and reconnect with the plants and the animals and the sky. And I mean, specifically, Sharon Firth talks about her experience running her dad's trap line in a Aklavik. And she says that running her trap line as a child gave her the physical endurance that she needed in order to excel in cross-country skiing. And so, yes, these children may have learned how to cross-country ski, but they already came with a lot of experience about the land and about their bodies and about how to be strong Indigenous people. We also know that there were other forms of culture at residential schools, including Girl Guides and Boy Scouts and cadets. Here are a few, again, some photos from the archives. And I, not in the book, but in other places, I have looked at how Indigenous children, specifically girls, have used these, quote unquote opportunities, because again, we know that Girl Guides was intended to create nice white Canadians. We can see how children use these colonial programs to their own advantage. Here's an example of a brownie who was working towards her doll making badge and made a doll who was brown, who wore traditional clothing that had fur on it. In other places, such as an article that I co-authored with Dr. Jessica Duncan, we have talked about student culture at residential schools, namely by analyzing yearbooks. So I point this out as another source of reading that you could do if you're interested. So student images in yearbooks, materials that student created, poems that they wrote, stories that they shared, but also very disturbing accounts of what students learned. And I say that because in some residential school yearbooks, we see students who are photographed wearing blackface. And so an example of how Indigenous children were taught racism at residential schools. So Jess Duncan and I have recently published the How I Survived podcast. The project of How I Survived specifically looks at the history of recreation and childhood culture at residential schools in the larger north of the Northwest Territories. And so we published the first season in October. We've been slowly releasing the episodes. I believe Sharon Firth's episode is the last one in the season, and that is going to be up next week. So if anyone wants to listen to interviews with survivors of residential schools in the Northwest Territories that focus on sport and recreation at residential schools, you can find the How I Survived podcast at anywhere you get your podcasts. Also, and I'm just going to start to wrap up here, but one thing that became very apparent, but was always like a mystery to me, was the involvement and importance of parents. This did not come up a lot in the interviews, and I came to learn that it was too painful to talk about, that survivors could talk about their own experience of being institutionalized, but very rarely did they ever talk about what it felt like for their own children to be removed and to have their kids away at residential schools. I was able to do some specific interviewing around this, and I also was able to find some historical sources that talk about the involvement of parents. And so you'll see in the book that in chapter 1, I ground the story with parents. And then in chapter 7, I also end the story with our parents. And really, they were an important part of a child's experience. You know, they, like on the left here, they showed up and gave demonstrations right in front of the school. This was a part of the Northern Games, and this family is from Paulatuk, and you can see community members, but also children standing along the fence watching. And so parents continued to be cultural teachers, even if they had to show up in Inuvik with all of the items that they needed. The photo in the middle is the Carpenter family. Fred Carpenter wrote numerous letters to the Inuvik Drum, which was a newspaper, calling for the construction of a day school in Sax Harbor so he could keep his kids at home, so they would not have to board an aircraft and go to Inuvik. And then on the right here, we have my late friend, Newt Hansen, who is wearing a beautiful Inuvialuit coat that his family made him at Stringer Hall. And so this ongoing practice of care and love that families instilled in their children was always present. So my concluding slide here, what to take away from all of this. So genocide and Indigenous forms of strength can exist at the same time. This does not mean that children benefited from their institutionalization or had overall good experiences or that it was in their best interest. So these kinds of phrases that I have in the scare quotes are denialism rhetoric. What it does mean, though, is that children used various forms of strength to persevere while parents were continually advocating and caring for them. We also do know that Indigenous children were victims of Indian residential schools and the federal government and Christian organizations. And we do know that at residential schools, children disappeared or died while institutionalized. And so really through this book, By Strength, We Are Still Here, I placed a priority on partnerships and relationships and reciprocity. And Boy, I have so many photos from over the years that I could share, but one of my favorite is from a book launch that I did in Inuvik before Christmas. About 120 people came, and it was just a celebration of belonging and of family and of nation builders, you know, because as students, as academics, as community members, the work that we do every day, we are rebuilding our nation. We are nation builders, and whether we like it or not, we are advocating for a happier and a healthier community. So thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure to give this talk. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I am going to turn it over to somebody else to run the Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Fraser. At this point, we're going to say goodbye to the guests who have joined us on Zoom, and we're going to open up the discussion to just Crystal and the class, the students.